The citation had been filed incorrectly. Subcommander Threnvale discovered this on a Tuesday morning, Earth's calendar, not the station's, though she had long since stopped distinguishing between them in her private tracking, while reviewing the personnel database for a routine training rotation. The citation had been filed under a case number that didn't match the incident it described, cross-referenced to a record that, when she pulled it, turned out to be a cargo manifest from 18 months prior. Someone in the administrative chain had made an error. The error was small. The kind that happens when paperwork follows a critical incident through too many processing hands too quickly. The kind that causes no immediate harm because the incident is over and the people involved are either fine or aren't, and either way, the form is just a form. Threnvale corrected the filing. She gave it the right case number. She cross-referenced it properly. She was thorough because thorough was what she had been for 11 years in the Compact Joint Training Authority, would continue to be regardless of whether anyone noticed. Then she read the citation's content, because she hadn't read it before. She had assumed it was the kind of citation she processed dozens of times a year. Commendation for performance above standard, specific incident noted, signatory from the relevant training commander. She read it because she was correcting the file, and correcting a file meant reading it. She read it twice. Then she pulled the original incident report, which was filed correctly under a separate case number, because the incident report and the citation had been processed by two different offices who had not coordinated their numbering system, and she read that. Then she sat in her office for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. The citation was for a Compact Training Authority instructor named Vostar, the Thorali, 14 years in training service. Commendation for exceptional conduct during the third cycle survival assessment on Kareth Station's outer training ring, 8 months ago. 3 cadets involved. Outcome, all 3 recovered. Minor injuries, returned to training rotation within 2 weeks. The incident report told a different story from the citation summary. Or rather, it told the same story with the parts that had been compressed in the citation expanded into specificity, and the specificity changed the texture of everything. Threnvale called the training commander's office. The training commander for Kareth Station was a Serenthi named Velorn who received her call with the mild professional courtesy of someone dealing with an administrative inquiry on a Tuesday morning. The Vostar citation, Threnvale said. The survival assessment incident. The filing error was flagged, Velorn said. We were aware it needed correction. I've corrected it, Threnvale said. I read the incident report. A brief pause. Then you have the information, Velorn said. I have the incident report's information, Threnvale said. I have 3 pieces of information that the citation's summary omits. I want to understand why they were omitted. Velorn's pause was longer this time. What 3 pieces? She said, though something in her voice said she knew exactly what 3 pieces. The duration, Threnvale said. The temperature. And the cadet species. The survival assessment on Kareth Station's outer training ring had been running for 6 days when the environmental system failed. This was the kind of failure that training facilities had extensive protocols for because training facilities that ran survival simulations understood that the difference between a controlled difficult environment and an uncontrolled dangerous one was infrastructure, and infrastructure failed. The protocols were comprehensive. The response time was designed to be fast. The response time, in this specific instance, had been insufficient. The Outer Ring Zone 7 was the facility's harshest simulation environment, calibrated to replicate the conditions of a Class 5 environmental hazard for training purposes: extreme cold, reduced atmospheric oxygen, surface conditions requiring full environmental suit management. Cadets assigned to Zone 7 were there for 3-day rotations with the understanding that the environment was challenging and the infrastructure was maintained. The environmental system failure had taken Zone 7 from Class 5 simulation to conditions that the post-incident assessment classified as Class 7 actual. 3 cadets had been in Zone 7 when the failure occurred. They were 8 hours into their rotation. They were human. The human physiology data in the Compact's Training Authority files described human cold tolerance as below average for registered member species, human altitude tolerance as moderate, and human performance in combined cold and low oxygen environments as significantly degraded above threshold exposure duration. The threshold exposure duration for Class 7 conditions, according to the data, was approximately 90 minutes. The 3 cadets had been in Zone 7 for 11 hours before the environmental system was restored. 11 hours at Class 7 conditions. The incident report noted that Instructor Vostar had entered Zone 7 6 hours after the failure was detected, when it became clear that the repair timeline was extending beyond what the facility's monitoring team had initially projected. She had entered with supplemental equipment. She had remained with the cadets for the final 5 hours until the system was restored. The incident report noted her actions as decisive and appropriate to the situation. The incident report also noted, in a section that had apparently not made it into the citation summary, that upon discovery of the cadet's condition at the 6-hour mark, Vostar had made an assessment that the standard extraction procedure, which would have required the cadets to move through the compromised zone to the emergency exit corridor, presented a risk higher than the risk of maintained shelter with supplemental equipment while the repair was completed. She had made this assessment alone. She had implemented it alone. She had been wrong about one thing, which was the remaining repair duration she had been given by the facility team, which had subsequently extended by 2 additional hours. She had remained for 11 hours total in a Class 7 environment with compromised equipment, keeping 3 human cadets alive in conditions that should have killed them. The cadets were fine. The incident report said this clearly. Minor injuries. 2 weeks recovery. Returned to training rotation. Vostar's medical report, which was attached to the incident file and which Threnvale pulled and read with increasing attention, was more complicated. 11 hours of Class 7 exposure in thoraly physiology produced outcomes that the medical team described as significant, though full recovery projected with appropriate rehabilitation. The word significant in a medical report was doing the same work that non-actionable had done in the diplomatic brief that Threnvale had read once and never forgotten many years ago. It was a formal way of saying that the honest thing was harder to look at. The citation summary omitted the duration and the temperature because they make the incident harder to process administratively, Velorn said, when Threnvale asked the question directly. The standard commendation framework isn't designed for, she stopped. For what that incident actually was. For what it actually was, Threnvale said, is how I want to file it. The standard framework. I'm aware of the standard framework, Threnvale said. I have been working within the standard framework for 11 years. I'm asking you whether the standard framework is sufficient for this situation. Another pause. No, Velorn said. Honestly, no. Threnvale went to Kareth Station. She did not send a junior administrator. She did not arrange the meeting through the standard commendation processing protocol. She booked transit, made the 11-hour journey, and arrived on a Wednesday morning with an appointment she had made directly with Instructor Vostar's supervisor, bypassing 3 levels of administrative routing. This was not standard procedure. She was aware of this. She was the subcommander of the Compact Joint Training Authority's Documentation and Recognition Division, and the decision to be present for something was, technically, within her authority, and she had decided to be present for this. Vostar's supervisor was a broad, composed thoraly named Corvell who received Threnvale in his office with the wariness of a department head who has been contacted by administration and does not yet know whether the contact is good news. Threnvale gave him the short version of why she was there: the filing error, the corrected citation, the discrepancy between the citation summary and the incident report, and her intention to review the commendation classification with appropriate consideration for what the record actually described. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Vostar is in recovery, he said. She's been cleared for modified duty since month 3, but the full rehabilitation is ongoing. I know, Threnvale said. I read the medical report. She didn't file for medical accommodation, Corvell said. She submitted her return-to-work request 6 weeks after the incident. Her division chief sent it back twice. She submitted it a 3rd time with a doctor's notation and it was approved for modified duty. Threnvale sat with this for a moment. She filed 3 times, she said. She wanted to be back, Corvell said. He said it with the tone of someone who is not trying to make a point but is answering a question that has more than one kind of answer. She filed 3 times because she wanted to come back to teaching. Not because she was impatient with the recovery. Because the teaching mattered to her more than the accommodation did. Is she available to speak with me? Threnvale said. I'll ask, he said. Vostar's office was small in the way of offices belonging to instructors who spend most of their time on the training floor rather than at a desk. The desk itself held organized assessment materials and a scheduling system and one personal item, a framed photograph, Earth format, printed on actual paper. Threnvale noticed it when she sat down. She did not ask about it immediately. Vostar was 43 years old and moved with the slight deliberateness of someone who has a rehabilitating injury and has learned to work within it without advertising the fact. She sat down across from Threnvale with the composed attention of someone who has been told that administration wants to speak with them and has decided to be present for whatever that means. Subcommander, she said. I was told you reviewed the incident file. I corrected a filing error and then reviewed the file, yes, Threnvale said. I want to understand what happened in Zone 7. Vostar looked at her steadily. The incident report is thorough. The incident report is accurate, Threnvale said. I want to understand it. Those are different things. Vostar was quiet for a moment. What specifically do you want to understand? The assessment you made at Hour 6, Threnvale said. When you arrived in Zone 7 and evaluated the extraction option against the shelter option. I want to understand how you made that call. Vostar looked at the desk for a moment. Not avoiding the question. Finding the honest answer. The extraction corridor was compromised by the same failure that took down the environmental system, she said. The corridor runs through the same infrastructure loop. I knew this because I had read the facility schematics before entering. I read the schematics every time I enter a zone, standard preparation. I knew that if the environmental system had failed completely, the corridor's thermal management was also degraded. Moving 3 cadets in their physical state through a degraded corridor was a higher risk than maintaining shelter with the supplemental equipment I was carrying. You calculated this before you entered, Threnvale said. I calculated the range of scenarios before I entered, Vostar said. The actual decision was made after I assessed the cadets' condition. What was their condition? Vostar was quiet again. This pause was different from the previous ones. They were in the shelter area, she said. All 3 of them, together. They had already done what they should have done. Pooled thermal management, reduced activity to minimize caloric expenditure, maintained the shelter's structural integrity. They had been doing this for 6 hours in conditions that exceed their physiological tolerance threshold. She paused. They were doing everything right. They were just... She stopped. Running out of time, Threnvale said. Running out of time, Vostar said. Yes. The situation was correct and the biology was failing anyway. 6 hours of human physiology in Class 7 conditions. She paused. The incident report's phrasing for their condition is compromised but functional. The clinical language is accurate. What it doesn't convey is... She stopped again. Tell me, Threnvale said. Vostar looked at her directly. They were frightened, she said. All 3 of them. Genuinely frightened. And they were still doing everything right. Frightened and methodical and running out of margin, and when I came in they looked at me with... She stopped a 3rd time and this time the stop was longer. I've been an instructor for 14 years. I've had cadets in difficult situations. I've never seen that specific thing before. Where the fear is completely visible and the function is completely intact. Where someone is terrified and still making correct decisions inside the terror. She paused. I made the shelter decision because the extraction corridor was the higher risk. But I also made it because I was not willing to move people who were doing that well in that situation into a scenario where what they were doing might not be enough. Threnvale sat with this. You trusted their competence, she said. I trusted their determination, Vostar said. Those aren't the same thing. Competence is what you can do. Determination is what you do when you can't do enough anymore. She looked at her desk for a moment. The 5 hours I was with them, they kept talking. Not panicking. Talking. Planning for after. What they'd do differently in the next rotation. What the assessment had shown them about shelter construction. What they wanted for breakfast when they got out. She paused. I was tracking their physiological indicators every 30 minutes. By hour 9, the numbers were, she stopped. The numbers were telling me one thing. Their behavior was telling me something different. I kept tracking the numbers and I kept watching the behavior and I made decisions based on both. The outcome, Threnvale said. Minor injuries. Full recovery. Yes, Vostar said. Your outcome, Threnvale said. The medical report used the word significant. Vostar looked at her steadily. I'm recovering, she said. The report was more specific than that. The pause. The Thorali cold tolerance threshold is higher than the human one, Vostar said. 11 hours at Class 7 conditions is within our documented survival range. It is not within our documented full recovery range. She said this without drama. Factually, I have some permanent reduction in peripheral nerve sensitivity in my lower extremities. It affects my mobility slightly. I've adapted. You sustained permanent injury, Threnvale said. I sustained the injury that was required by the situation, Vostar said. She said it the same way. No drama. The 3 cadets are in training rotation. They're doing well. One of them posted the highest marks in the structural assessment component last month. She paused. That's not a trade-off. That's just what happened. Threnvale looked at the photograph on the desk. May I ask about the photograph? Vostar looked at it. The cadets, she said. They sent it after they returned to rotation. All 3 of them with a note. She paused. The note is behind it. I keep both. What did the note say? Vostar was quiet for a moment. Then she said, it said that they had talked about what to write for a long time and had kept not finding the right thing, and finally one of them had said that maybe there wasn't a right thing and the honest thing was to write the true thing, and the true thing was, we know what you did, and we know what it cost, and we will not forget either one. The room was quiet for a moment. They're human, Threnvale said. The cadets. Yes, Vostar said. How were they afterward? When they came back to training? Vostar considered this. Different, she said. Not damage different. Certain different. Like the incident settled something for them. They knew something about themselves that they hadn't known before, and the knowing of it was steady. She paused. I've thought about that a lot. What exactly they learned in Zone 7 that they didn't know before. She looked at the photograph. I think they learned the distance between what they believed about themselves and what they actually were. And it turned out the distance was smaller than they'd feared. And you? Threnvale said. Vostar looked at her. I learned that talking about breakfast plans is an extremely effective way to keep 3 people alive, she said. And then, quieter, I also learned that there is something very specific about watching people who are frightened stay functional. It doesn't make the fear smaller. It makes what they do with it larger. Threnvale returned to the administrative offices. She wrote the revised commendation documentation across the remainder of that day and all of the following one, not because the writing was difficult but because she was doing it precisely in the way that precision required. She was not satisfied with the standard commendation framework. She had told Thorne this. She had meant it. The standard framework covered performance above expectation in a defined operational parameter. What Vostar had done was not above expectation in a defined parameter. It was, and Threnvale struggled with this phrasing and kept struggling and eventually settled on a version that was accurate. It was a decision made in the specific space where all the parameters had failed and the only thing left was what the person doing it was willing to accept as the cost of the right outcome. The commendation she filed at the end of day 2 was not a standard citation. It was 3 pages, which was unusual. Standard citations were 1 page. It described the incident accurately, including the duration and the temperature and the cadet species and the specific nature of the injury Vostar had sustained. It described the decision at hour 6 in the language Vostar had used. The calculation, the assessment, the trust extended to 3 cadets' determination that had been holding for 6 hours in conditions that should have been impossible. It described the 5 hours that followed. The physiological tracking. The breakfast plans. It described, in the final paragraph, the photograph on the desk and what the note behind it said. Threnvale submitted the 3-page citation to the commendation board with a cover memo that said the standard commendation framework was insufficient for this case and requested review under the Joint Authority's elevated recognition provisions, which were provisions she had read into existence 3 years ago and which had never been applied because the situations for which they had been written did not, in her experience, arise very often. The commendation board reviewed the citation. They reviewed the incident report. They reviewed the medical file. The board chair, a Serenthi named Maritvel who had been on the board for 12 years and had processed more citations than Threnvale had filed, called her with questions that told Threnvale the board had read the citation carefully and was taking it seriously. The injury classification, Maritvel said, the permanent component. Documented in the medical file, Threnvale said. She filed for return to duty 6 weeks out. 3 times, Threnvale said. The first 2 were returned. The third was approved for modified duty. The pause. She's still teaching, Maritvel said. Yes, Threnvale said. On modified duty. With adapted mobility protocols. Another pause. She adapted her movement patterns so that she can continue to do the work. She told me she adapted because the teaching mattered more to her than the accommodation did. The pause on Maritvel's end was long enough that Threnvale waited it out. The elevated provisions, Maritvel said finally. I want to apply them. I want to go further than that. How much further? Threnvale said. The Compact Joint Authority's Distinguished Service Recognition, Maritvel said. It's been awarded 3 times in the authority's history. The criteria require unanimous board approval and Compact Council endorsement. Threnvale sat with this for a moment. That process takes months, she said. Yes, Maritvel said. I want to start it today. The process took 5 months. During those 5 months, several things happened that Threnvale tracked with the careful attention she applied to things that were still developing and therefore still capable of going wrong. The commendation board conducted a full review. The Compact Council's Recognition Committee reviewed the board's submission. Human liaison officers were contacted regarding the human cadets' participation in the recognition process, because distinguished service recognitions were public events and the cadets' presence or absence was relevant. The liaison officers conferred with the cadets. The cadets' response, which came back through the liaison channel and which Threnvale read twice, said, "We will be there. All 3 of us. Whatever it requires. Whatever it requires." She noted the phrasing. The recognition ceremony was held at Careth Station's main assembly hall 5 months and 12 days after Threnvale had corrected the filing error on a Tuesday morning. The assembly hall held 360 people. It was full. Threnvale had not anticipated this. Distinguished service ceremonies were typically attended by the relevant command staff and institutional representatives, not by 360 people who had arranged their schedules around a recognition event at a training station on the outer ring. She found out why when she arrived and Corvell met her at the entrance. The word spread, he said simply. When the commendation was filed, people read it. The citation was in the public record. People read it and, he paused. People wanted to be here. The 3 human cadets were in the front row. She recognized them from the photograph on Vostar's desk, though the photograph had been taken in the immediate aftermath of the incident and they looked different now. Older in the specific way people look older when they have been through something that permanently rearranged what they know about themselves. Certain, the way Vostar had described. She looked at them and thought about frightened and methodical and running out of margin and still talking about breakfast plans, and she understood, in a way she had been approaching for 5 months, something she had not been fully able to articulate before. The ceremony was not long. Threnvale had written the recognition address herself, because the address needed to be accurate and she knew the file better than anyone. She spoke for 12 minutes. She described what had happened in Zone 7 with the same precision she had applied to the citation. The failure, the assessment, the calculation, the 5 hours, the injury, the 3 files for return to duty. The teaching continued on adapted protocols. She described the photograph and the note. She read the note aloud. "We know what you did. We know what it cost. We will not forget either one. When she finished speaking, the assembly hall was quiet in the specific way of a large room full of people who are not making noise because the noise they would make hasn't finished forming yet. Maratvel presented the Distinguished Service Recognition. Vostar received it with the composed attention she brought to everything, standing upright with the adapted posture she had developed over 5 months of modified duty, and she said what Distinguished Service recipients traditionally said, which was a brief formal acknowledgement, and then she said something that was not the traditional statement. She said, "The 3 cadets in the front row kept themselves alive for 6 hours before I arrived. I kept them company for 5 more. The commendation belongs to all 5 of us." One of the human cadets, the one who had, Threnvale would later verify, posted the highest marks in the structural assessment component, stood up. He stood up without being invited to, which was a breach of ceremony protocol, and the assembly hall was still enough that the sound of him standing was audible. He looked at Vostar and he said, in a voice that was not performing steadiness but was actually steady, "You came in. That's what you did. You didn't have to come in." The assembly hall remained quiet. "The repair team would have reached us," the cadet said. "Eventually. Maybe. Or we would have reached an outcome that wasn't good. We don't know which one. What we know is that you came in and you stayed, and you talked to us about breakfast for 5 hours, and we are here." He paused. "Whatever we do with the rest of our careers, whatever we become, we do it because you came in." The assembly hall found its voice then. Threnvale stood at the side of the room and listened to 360 people who had arranged their schedules to be present for something they had read about in a citation and felt the need to witness in person, and she thought about the filing error that had started this. A wrong case number. A citation cross-referenced to a cargo manifest. A Tuesday morning administrative audit that had produced, through the specific chain of small acts that small acts sometimes produce, this room and these people and this moment. She thought about what would not have been different if she hadn't corrected the file. Vostar would still be teaching on adapted protocols. The 3 cadets would still be in rotation. The breakfast plans conversation would still have happened in Zone 7 and would still have helped keep 3 people alive. The injury would still be permanent. The note would still be behind the photograph. None of the substance of it would have changed. What would have changed was the record. What would have changed was who knew. She thought about the note again. "We know what you did and we know what it cost, and we will not forget either one." She thought that this was the thing that accurate records were for. Not to create the reality of what had happened. The reality existed independently of the record. Records were for the second and third sentence of the note. For the knowing and the not forgetting. For the 360 people in the assembly hall who had read a citation that had been filed correctly and had felt, in reading it, that they needed to be in the room where the recognition happened. After the ceremony, Threnvale spent an hour in the reception that followed, and at the end of it she went back to Vostar's office because she had a question she had been holding since the assembly hall and she wanted to ask it while the asking felt possible. Vostar was there, because the reception had been attended by 360 people and Vostar was not someone who spent long in rooms with 360 people in them. She was at her desk. The photograph was visible. "The 3 cadets," Threnvale said, "after they came back to rotation. You said they were certain. That the incident had settled something." "Yes," Vostar said. "Did you ask them what it had settled?" Vostar looked at her. "Yes," she said. "One of them told me. The one who spoke today." She paused. "He said that before Zone 7 he had been functioning on what he believed he could do. And Zone 7 had shown him what he actually did. And the difference between those two things, between believed capability and demonstrated capability under the actual worst conditions, was that the demonstrated version couldn't be argued with." She paused. "He said, I know now what I am. Before, I only hoped." Threnvale looked at the photograph. The 3 cadets, with the note behind it. She thought about a woman who had entered a zone she didn't have to enter. Who had stayed for 5 hours she didn't have to stay. Who had come back from a permanent injury to teach again because the teaching mattered more than the accommodation. Who had stood in an assembly hall and said the commendation belongs to all 5 of us. She thought about frightened and methodical, simultaneously, for 6 hours, in impossible conditions, talking about breakfast, which was not bravery in the way bravery was usually described, not loud, not defiant, not performed, but was the specific, quiet, completely unargumentable thing that happens when someone is all the way to their limit and continues anyway, because the continuing is what they actually are. She thought about 5 months of the process taking exactly as long as it needed to take. She thought about 360 people reading a citation and feeling they needed to be in the room. She thought about a filing error on a Tuesday morning. She thought that the galaxy changed in the ways it changed not through the large and visible events that the large and visible record captured, but through the small and specific events that happened in Zone 7 during an environmental failure at a training station on the Outer Ring, in the quiet between the Hour 6 assessment and the system restoration at Hour 11, in the 5 hours of staying that no one required, and that changed 3 people's understanding of what they actually were, not what they believed, and that changed 1 person's body permanently, and that produced a note on paper behind a photograph that said the thing that needed saying with the precision that only true things have. We know what you did, and we know what it cost, and we will not forget either one. She had corrected a filing error. It was, she thought, the most important administrative act of her 11-year career. Not because the correction created what had happened, because the correction meant that what had happened was in the record, and the record meant that 360 people could read it. And those 360 people, and whoever came after them who read what they had read and felt what they had felt and understood what they had understood, would carry it forward into what they became and what they did and what they chose when their own Zone 7s arrived. And the Zone 7s always arrived, for everyone in one form or another, and in that specific and invisible way, 5 hours of breakfast conversations in a compromised training environment at the edge of. Everything would continue happening again and again, in the decisions of people who knew the story and in the decisions of people who had never heard it but were shaped by people who had, compounding forward through time in the way that the true things always do. Quietly. Permanently.